I have a knack for thinking in systems. I'm not sure why it is. Maybe it's left-handed, but it got reinforced several times. And the way it got reinforced is I handed over the books I learned from. This is Dennis Sherwood, Seeing the Forest from the Trees, to other people, saying, "Read this." They came back and said we couldn't make it work. I said, "Why can't you make it work? What is so hard about forming a causal loop diagram versus a linear?" We said we don't know. They're like, that doesn't seem hard to me. And so that started a process of saying, well, wow, if I can think in these loops and connect systems together, I wonder what happens next, right? And so that stuck with me, and that stuck with me for now 20 years. And so, I've acquired more skill in that. And I enjoy the fact that you can zoom out all the way and it still makes sense. Normally, when you zoom out, you lose resolution, right? Things become smaller. In systems, when you zoom out, the systems connect and you see larger systems at work, right? It's like a series of Matryoshka dolls. Every system feeds something to the next level system, all the way down to the smallest.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to your brand new podcast called In Your Shoes. This podcast is for you to learn more about new people and professions from around the world. I would like to take you on a journey to understand the life and times of a new person every 2 weeks and get a chance to get into their shoes to learn what they do, why they do, and how they do it.
On the show today, I have Rana, who is currently the head of learning experiences at SAP Academy of Engineering. I met Rana years ago at a service design competition, and I found him to be a really passionate user experience designer and a deeply thoughtful person. I enjoyed so much working with him at that time that we kept in touch, and my previous guests in the podcast really asked me to get him on the show. And I'm so fortunate that I finally got the opportunity to get Rana as a guest today. So, welcome to the podcast, Rana.
Thank you. By the way, like I was telling you, I ain't so busy. It's just the time zone that was the problem. I would love to say my calendar is so filled out, Vivek. No, that's not true. I also think that everybody, your previous guest was probably on the same team too, no? From the service jam.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, that was such a fun time. Okay, let's chat. What would be useful?
Yeah, I mean, before we get into interesting stuff, we start with if you could just introduce yourself to our audience, like who you are, where you come from, and what are you doing for your living?
So, first of all, thank you for having me. It's fun to be able to reflect back and be asked questions. It's a rare privilege. So, hi, I'm Rana. Um, I am, well, my title says I'm, Director of Learning Experiences, but I have three careers, and this is the third one. I've been in business for a bunch of years. I've then been an engineer for about seven, and then I've been a designer for more than a decade now. And where I'm right now is an evolution of where I started. The goal was always to be useful with whatever skills I have. And I work at the Academy for Engineering at SAP, and it's basically a unit within this. Well, you can think of it as a unit, but it's actually a small organization within the organization responsible for um, bringing back pride in engineering at SAP. So we're not the only one doing it, but essentially, we think we are responsible for creating the next generation of engineers, multidimensional engineers, as we call it. And my role within that is to kind of craft the curriculum, but also exactly how the programs would operate, what the experience is like. So that's why you can think of it as learning design, learning engineering.
Could you share a little bit about, first of all, I really liked this concept of bringing pride back to engineering. And what do you mean by a multi-dimensional engineering or engineer in this
Mm,
case?
mm. So um, we realized, and probably you're not the only one, the SAP finds itself in a situation where it needs to look at it, but I think most engineers get to this point on their own, which is, well, the skill sets we need in the future are so different from the skill sets we've been used to in the past. SAP is the equivalent of Apple for enterprise. It's vertically integrated, it's all its proprietary stuff. And now we're moving to the cloud. And we've done a bunch of acquisitions that put us in a good position, but the engineers need to transition culturally as well. And we've realized that this is both very new and very old. By that I mean, when we started out as a company in 72, everybody did everything. There was no distinction between understanding the customer, designing it, making it, giving feedback. It was basically the same thing. And you invented the technologies you needed. But as we grew, we've forgotten what it's like. We become siloed like any other company does. And um, in some sense, the best engineers I've ever worked with always had more than engineering to them. Some of them was a nuclear physicist who was doing quality. One of them had spent a whole bunch of years doing his PhD in humanities, but also coded. So, multidimensional engineer is an engineer who has more than code to speak for. And
Mm-hmm.
we think of these as five values, by the way. We think of them as five C's. And these C's represent these values which you think are essential for being multidimensional. They are, and they're paired. One is courage and curiosity. They're internal attributes. And courage is kind of the mother of all attributes, right? Without that, nothing else works. Curiosity, because we are expecting engineers to keep learning because there is a half life to your knowledge. It will fade out every 2.5 years to 3 years, and it's shortening, 18 months now.
Mm.
And how do you keep learning unless you have curiosity? It's a skill. It's not a skill. It's a trait that's been um, dialed down because of the education and work systems, but it's present to all of us. So that's two. The other two are community and compassion. We think this is the quirk of the group I work with, but compassion is not just good, it's good business. It allows for psychological safety. We know that's a leading indicator of how innovative teams can be. And it also is a way to deal with conflict. So when you're dealing with multiple technologies, integrating them from diverse sources, you need to have courage to stand up for a conviction, but compassion to accept the difference. So we think compassion is important. And community or giving. So these are the traits we look for, and we put them through. You can think of it as a pressure chamber where these traits are amplified into actual behavior. So curiosity becomes, learning agility, courage becomes risk-taking ability, and so on and so forth. So that's our definition of multidimensional, but the basic idea is straightforward. If you are full-rounded, well-rounded as an engineer, you understand technology, you understand humanities, you understand business, you're probably in the best possible place to be future-proof.
Wow, I think I am really inspired by the facets of this multi-dimensional engineer. Um, I wanted to spend so much time really going into each of these aspects with you, but we'll get there.
Mm,
But
mm,
I want to first start. This is actually a very interesting job. Really helping the engineers to expand their understanding of what engineering is really is, and
mm,
giving them aspects of the facets that you talked about, which I think
mm.
some of us are not trained in a typical educational environment where we come from. So
True.
I'm very curious, like, for you to be in this position to drive this work,
Mm,
share a little bit about how did you land up here, especially in this particular role.
mm. Um, I would be lying if I said I planned it. Um, I would. They're the best thing I can think about, and this is probably a pattern for my career. Is This is like falling upwards. It feels like the process is organic rather than analytical. It is synthetic rather than planned, and by that I mean, um, if you look at what it takes to put together an experience for engineers which is multidimensional, and everybody in the team is like that. We live the stuff, we try and teach, and if you can't live it, we can't teach it. And so that puts us in a position of having to know what we are trying to teach for really well. And so because I've been an engineer and developed enterprise applications for about 7 years, because I've been a designer who's worked on the research, on the interaction design. I didn't do visual design. I realized I have to go to college for that. It's way out of my league, or needs more time. Um, I arrived eventually through the process, and I started teaching the design process first within the company, then to startups. That's how we met in some sense. I realized I really enjoy simplifying what is a complex process design, and the teaching was kind of natural to me. So that strain came from there. then I also have as an engineer, this as an engineer, kind of purity, rigor, discipline, structure. This is all stuff that is 101 for engineering. That stayed with me as a designer. And as a designer, I enjoy minimalism, purity, right? And so that I picked up from a career as a designer. So when I now design experiences, it has structure. We design experiences that last 6 months, and it's intense and they're immersive. I simplify when I teach. I simplify what I'm trying to teach down to its essence. So we have an alternative way of teaching design we call the personal workflow. It's based on the idea of a hypothesis and a bet, which comes from the world of startups. And this, finish that comes from a good design is all of that from being a designer, which is I want the experience to be perfect. And I realized that I swing between two states. I enjoy the very big, the complex, the systems part, and I enjoy the very small. Like I'm just as happy hacking the coffee machine and making work better as I am, intervening a company and finding how do you shift culture. So all of this it's 2020 looking back, but going forward, it feels like you arrive at a place where you've run out of steam for the current job and you're looking for something new and you don't know what it is. And in that gap, which is scary, you ask people what's up and you search and you do some soul searching and diary writing and resumes and so on and so forth. And then a direction appears. So I'm making it sound more glamorous than it really is. Is nightmarish going through it, but it's become easier to know that, well, everything has a lifespan and that typically it's about 2 to 3 years before you have to reinvent yourself. And the only thing I've held together is I like to build on what I've had before. I don't like throwing stuff away. So what have I learned as an engineer? What have I learned as a designer? And how do I bring this into teaching? And it just turns out by, having done it, I enjoy the teaching process and I enjoy crafting an experience that feels like it has flow. I know it's a long-winded answer and I'm slightly caffeinated, so apologies, but that's the best I would say. I can explain the mess that is my career.
Oh, thank you so much. I think I
Yeah.
really enjoyed actually going through that answer of yours. And I was just thinking about, like, what should I not ask here? Like, it's so much of things packed up in that answer. But I want to just stay on a particular point around
Sure.
the aspect of enjoying the big and the small.
Yeah.
I also like the example you mentioned about hacking the coffee machine and also interviewing the company in shift culture.
Mm,
Let's keep for a moment this as the anchor and
mm,
tell us a little bit about why is this enjoyable for you first, this
mm,
going from very big to very small, and secondly,
mm,
what have you learned from doing this, from practicing this, which has
mm,
uh, positively affected your life today?
mm, mm. Thank you. I think that's the privilege of being interviewed, that I'm forced to find answers for things that I've done intuitively. So, since the time we know each other, which must be, God, it must be 15 years or more, no? Or 10 years at
10
least. How
years,
long have we
yeah.
known? 10 years, right?
10 years.
Since the time that I know you, I knew Dushyant, everybody else on that crew, um, I have been pursuing a thread of systems thinking. And I realized that I have a knack for thinking in systems. I'm not sure why it is. Maybe it's left-handed, but it got reinforced several times. And the way it got reinforced is I handed over the books I learned from. This is Dennis Sherwood, Seeing the Forest from the Trees, to other people saying, read this. They came back and said, we couldn't make it work. I said, why can't you make it work? What is so hard about forming a causal loop diagram versus a linear? We said, we don't know. They're like, that doesn't seem hard to me. And so that started a process of saying, well, wow, if I can think in these loops and connect systems together, I wonder what happens next, right? And so that stuck with me, and that stuck with me for now 20 years. And so, I've acquired more skill in that. And I enjoy the fact that you can zoom out all the way and it still makes sense. Normally, when you zoom out, you lose resolution, right? Things become smaller. In systems, when you zoom out, the systems connect and you see larger systems at work, right? It's like a series of Matryoshka dolls. Every system feeds something to the next level system, all the way down to the smallest. That is fascinating for me. And you start seeing larger and larger effects. An example of this would be, um, well, just what we're seeing right now with the environment, right? We have essentially triggered this with carbon extraction. We've heated up the environment. You would think it's innocuous to just, yeah, more cars on the road, big deal, smokestack. but it adds up and it has massive consequences for life on the planet. But it's the underlying system is extremely simple. You've just overheated the system. The oceans aren't capable of keeping that much of heat, and so now there is no place for the heat to go, and so now it's coming back on us. And so that approach is super interesting for me. And the way I applied that was I said, well, I like that, Rana, but who the heck is going to give you a job? Right? Uh, because jobs are built around getting stuff done. And so the way I approach that, I would always look for the other end. I enjoy creating flow, right? So you can think of this as two states of flow. One state of flow is a very small. If your coffee machine is broken and I fix it and you have a more pleasurable coffee making experience, you feel good about it. It's an important part of your day. And I get a kick out of that too. And we actually did it in SAP. We fixed there was nobody using the coffee corner. We did a bunch of things, right? We made a little boundary so people who were actually hanging out felt there to pass through. We made lines like, the markers on the road which says slow lane, fast lane. We made the coffee machine quieter. We put a juicing machine, and suddenly the cafe was buzzing. That is great fun to see because you've lifted human energy. And systems is cognitive flow. You can make meaning at very high levels because you can see connection between things that don't seem connected. And suddenly, like, oh, wow, if I wiggle this end of the planet, that end of the planet is affected as well. Right. And so that's why I keep popping between these two. And the advantage of that is you can get into the weeds with detail and get lost, which is natural because you get sucked into a certain technological challenge or a design challenge. But when you pull back, meaning gets made. And if you pull back further, purpose emerges. Like, why are we doing all this stuff? What is the point of all of this stuff? Right. And the systems viewers help me identify purpose. And so when we realized, and purpose is really simple the way I think of it, right? It's stuff that you feel makes a difference in your world. And so for us, helping engineers become multidimensional is purpose. It's super simple to say, it's hard to do, but the impact on it is enormous if you can pull it off. And so, how the heck do you do that? So that's from that abstracted view, we think of the academy as an intervention. It is one piece of a very large machine. There are other people doing the same thing. We zoom all the way down to how do you teach, and we keep structure. We're saying every 10 minutes, your teaching time is 10 minutes, and something else has to happen. And so you can think of this as a zoom lens, the ability to zoom all the way down to the lowest level and zoom all the way up. And it's valuable if you can do it. I think life and education forces you to be stuck at like 1x, 2x, or 5x zoom. But if you can go to, 0.5x and 2000x, you have that much more flexibility to play with. So this may be gibberish, Vivek, so you should call me out. Like, Rana, what?
No, I liked where you're going with that, and I actually have a follow up for that. So if I come to you and say, Rana, I would love to groom this style of thinking in
Yeah.
terms of systems,
Mm.
and I'm sorry, I'm taking a
Go for it.
tangential view
Oh, yeah.
right now. What would be your advice for me? And I'm coming with the same background
Yeah.
as you, perhaps an
Yeah.
engineer, but I'm
Mm.
lost. So I
So
like
heavy.
what you
Yeah.
said, but I'm also very mindful that I need
Yeah.
this and I want to groom this. What do you would advise me to go back and do stuff or get experiences where I can groom this systems thinking in myself?
Mm. Good question. Thank you. Um, so I'll tell you what I've tried doing so far and kind of the limits of that. So because it comes intuitively caffeine intuitively to me, um, the teaching part has helped to kind of make the intuition obvious to somebody else can learn it. So the way I do it is, of course, it helps to have a good primer. And the book I started with, I mentioned before, was Dennis Sherwood. I think it's a manager's guide to systems thinking. It's not even like a full book, right? But it's fabulous because it introduces how causal loop diagrams work, what is the reinforcement loop, what is the balancing loop, basic language. But the way I introduce it is I disguise systems thinking. By that I mean it drives people crazy that things are not linear, right? we like things to be linear and seeking a goal and ending at that goal. Yet everything that you see in nature is exactly not that, right? And I love the word. So I've helped a couple of schools redesign their teaching experience, and so we formed a group that talks often. One of them offered a word, saying, "Nana, have you heard of this word called equifinality?" I said, "No, what is it?" He said, "It's from systems." I said, "Oh, let me look it up." And I did. And here's the difference between the word goal and equifinal. A goal is how a linear system operates, right? It's cause and effect, and it ends at one goal. An equifinal system has multiple paths to the same end state, right? And you are an equifinal system, and I'm an equifinal system. So creativity is multiple ways to the same end state, and that is how reality works, nature works. And the way I would do that is I would start creating these experiences where people go through the illusion of linearity, but then they deal with feedback loops. So I would say, well, just find one path through the system. How does that work? Okay. Now, if you loop back here to the start, what happens next? Oh, it changes the initial conditions. Oh, I understand. How does it change? Now go again. So all that to say that the way I would do it now, if I was to teach it to somebody or say, go do it, is pick a problem that feels a little like higher order for you, right? So if you're dealing with purely technical problems, zoom back a little bit and try and find a higher order technical problem, one that connects to other domains. And by the way, we have plenty. Just take two disconnected things. Take systemic racism and take financial incentives. Okay, and now try and connect these two concepts and see how they connect. They are connected for sure, but how are they connected? Or take policy, right? And that's your dishwasher, and this is my dishwasher. Her name is Champ. She loves anything that's on the floor, and so you will hear in the background too. Um, take and there is a couple of good tools I can recommend later, right? But take any two concepts which feel interesting to you and try and find a relationship between them and map it. In the process, you'll realize that it's not a linear connection between these two things, right? There are things that loop back, things that loop forward, and as they start looping, strange effects occur. So let's do a thought experiment. I'm doing this on the fly, so forgive me if it doesn't work out. But I was trying to map the connection between. Um, so this was a little while earlier. Let's take gun violence and um, democracy. Okay, so Second Amendment and gun violence. So arguably in America, where I'm right now at the moment, Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms. By itself, if you go one step forward, that's not a bad thing because at the time it was constructed, America essentially was occupied by the British and they revolted and they said, it's a right to bear arms. Not a bad thing. The effect of that has been that an entire industry arrived that allowed you to make guns because guns were going to be sold and bought. Because of that, a war arrived at some point and a military industrial complex was set up where essentially the private manufacturers were making guns for the government. Given that America, one more factor in this conversation is that America is highly competitive and highly individualistic, right? And it's really opportunity driven, market mechanics. So given the lever of market mechanics, this became a system where guns were created originally for wars, but now war had to be created for guns. The dynamic flipped, right? That led to a crazy situation that now you changed policy so that you can sell more guns whether or not there is a war. And as I go through the experiment, you can see, this is not a straight path. This is all non-linear stuff, right? One thing is affecting the other, then the second thing affects the first back. That changes how all of this operates. What the heck is going on, right? So if you take any two of these things and try and join them, you'll get a first glimpse of, oh my God, real life complexity is more than just one leads to the other. And that's the first step, right? If you find yourself um, hankering for more, then that's a step that you should take. If you find like, no, this, like in the Gita, right? Arjun saying, dude, take it away. It's too much. I can't bear to. Then that's okay. Back to the existing world, we would recognize that that's a preference, right? And so, therefore, I think the limitation of this kind of thinking is that you must have a high tolerance for ambiguity because you're trying to really think through stuff that nobody has asked, not even you. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And, I have a follow up to that. And to my understanding, this is a fantastic way of thinking how things are connected. And I think a lot of, if I reflect on what you just said, I think a lot of my early education, I think the industrialized education environment, we are so much fond of this linear relationship between
Right.
events, and we focus so much on linearity that I think we lose out this
Yeah.
thinking. So, from your essence, and I'm again, I think I like spending time here because it's such an interesting topic, and I'm okay. My listeners would also enjoy this, I
I
hope.
hope. We don't know. We'll
Uh,
find out. It may be like three
yeah, but
people,
I
including you,
think
me, and Dushyant. Like it.
but I trust my
Yeah,
audience. And obviously I'll get to know from my
sure.
feedback. What do you think, apart from my naive
Mm,
explanation that it's the industrialized academic situation that's leading us not to think like
mm,
this? What else is fueling this
mm,
uh, aspect of us going, not thinking
mm,
about through systems, but rather just stucking with the linear
mm,
thinking and linear relationship between
mm.
systems?
Thank you. So this will blow into a mini systems conversation. So let's jump into it and see how it goes. But I feel this is the quality of conversation that I think is really useful in these times, right? I mean, just look at here we are in America and we realize that, oh my goodness, this is potentially two countries with two different value systems. And how would you navigate this? So it's valuable to think like this. And the power of a naive question is that it forces you to ask a very basic question that gets lost in all of this stuff. So I'm totally for like naive questions to blow apart all this expertise. So it's a good start point, right? Saying, okay, where did this all begin? And the thing I've realized in systems is that individually, each of the vectors or the moves are not intended to be bad. They're intended to be useful at the time. So, to give you an example, the the industrialized education system was essentially the move away from the agrarian system. So you wanted to create masses of people who could work in a factory, and so you need to give them reading, writing, arithmetic, and that was needed. It was a huge improvement at the time. It's like the McDonaldization of education, right? That's all they knew. And the group I was talking about mentioned that at some point you had a huge influx of children in America and they had to be educated. And all America knew was the manufacturing process. So they applied it. So it was a great solution for the time. But the consequence of that, and we don't know enough about human potential to do anything else, right? The consequence of the time is that people essentially got put into a batch mode, right? And then we know the consequence of that. The one teacher teaching to everybody, like everybody learns the same way. The other thing though is now let's say you try and snap out of that. You go through the system, you realize something within you still doesn't want to give up your interest. You know this is not right for you. You go through your career. Um, Linearity, so you can think of this as left brain and right brain. Now, linearity is useful because things move. At least you can take a step at a time and it's predictable. And you know the next step is whether it's right or wrong, it's the next step. And that is very powerful at a psychological level because none of us like uncertainty, right? So there is also the psychological impetus to get to some place useful and then look back and saying, oh, I need to take a left or a right, but linearity gives you that. So when you start teaching this style, it feeds into that style of thinking, saying, oh man, I've achieved it, all the chaos was worth it, but now I have a degree, right? Oh, the pain was worth it, but now I'm a VP, or whatever that is. You forget that when you went through the path, it was actually a completely non-linear process. How you arrived at the job, the opportunities you got, the bet that a company took on you, why you got the job in the first place, the next gig that happened, they were all non-linear, right? So that's one overriding factor I think about, which is our desire for certainty. The other thing that happens, I think, is, and this is probably, is a cultural element, which is does a culture tolerate a certain amount of ambiguity in conversation. That doesn't have to be hyper precise. So, in some sense, you can think of this as India and or an Eastern and Western thing, right? If you have a Western mindset which is linear, and if you're in America, you can see everything works, everything clicks through, right? It is clean, sterile sometimes in the Bay Area, but everything works. It is an embodiment of this kind of thinking. It's much harder to introduce this in America because, like, dude, we are what we are because we got so far with linear thinking. That seems chaotic to me. If you think of Eastern philosophies, mystical philosophies, we look at non-linearity constantly. We think of Kal chakras. We are in the Kal Yuga. Everything is circular. Everything comes around. And so we are used to thinking of what goes around comes around. That karma and a greater accounting system, things like that, right? So it is built into us to expect ambiguity. Life is not certain. Kuch bhi ho sakta hai, or anything can happen. So your culture has a great effect on that. And so that's why I feel the Eastern parts of the world have a more philosophical view on this, and it's easier for them to slip into this kind of thinking, saying, yeah, sure, we don't know anything or everything. Let's see what the connections might be and let things emerge. And so that brings me to the third aspect, which is we really, really dislike being in any kind of a void, right? This inability, apart from wanting predictability, the thing we abhor the most, and you can test this in conversations, just be silent for a while and see who jumps into it, right? We do not like empty spaces. It is very uncomfortable. Yet, if you're creative, you know that all your originality came from that empty place. You had to be required because some synthesis happens in the background, right? Some connection happens outside of your line of sight. And that really is the systems part of your mind, the right brain working. And that has not been traditionally, arts has not been a part of education. It's been considered they are the poor stepchild, who does arts, you're like a poor painter. Yet arts, philosophy, those things are essential. Humanity is essential for developing this part of yourself, which understands the writer's process. Like I do morning pages, right? Comes straight out of Julia Cameron's the book on the writer's process. So multiple things. Like I said, this was a rabbit hole, but you could say that the structure that was introduced was one factor which just fed into a psychological need. Like, God, we have structure. Cause and effect is reverse. We had to have structure because we need it. How else would you teach people? But the fact that the culture values it made it harder to snap out of it. The fact that we have a bias towards certainty makes it even harder. The nice thing, though, is that the world we're in right now, so much of it is non-linear. You have no choice but to deal with it. Right? So you may be forced to confront the fact that the choice you make on what like you put has consequences for the society you live in. This is a strange moment to be in, right? That one little thumbs up, what difference does it make? One like button? Significant because it'll feed you back stuff that only you like and put you in a bubble, right? So you may have to be forced to be cognizant, like, ooh, this action could have crazy consequences. Let me think for a minute. Okay, I'll stop rambling. What do you think?
I think uh, I really like the emphasis on being or taking a pause before you jump into things. I think that pause, that moment between the actions is a great opportunity. And as you said, the space where you're not talking and you take your silence. I think this whole aspect of this dopamine kicks that we get today through different mediums
Yeah,
has reduced the margin and the opportunity to take that pause.
yeah,
And I think even if we start doing it little mindfully, taking that pause really allows us to think things differently. And I think
yeah,
that may be the start
yeah,
of realizing that there is more to just the immediate action of what I'm doing.
yeah,
There are aspects of stuff which I haven't thought about, and I need to be more deliberate.
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, I mean, I that's the feeling that comes to my mind when you were
yeah,
talking about this whole process.
yeah. So let me build on that briefly. I think what you're saying is really important because as a species, we can be socialized as easily as we can be desocialized. So our ability to think abstract, think in higher order, deal with ambiguity is like a muscle. It is learned because it's uncomfortable, and it can be unlearned and forgotten as well. So the next generation, which works only on text, and this was Windsurf talking about it at some point, that they have a problem with face-to-face conversations because they don't have as much time to write out a text, which they're used to, right? And so the chemistry of real life conversations is it's ambiguous, it is funky, it goes sideways sometimes, and that's what real life is like, but they don't like it. And that has huge consequences for civilization if everybody's looking at their phone. It seems innocuous, but consider the long-term consequences. And so making a pause, critical thinking, these are like hugely significant things, which all have, you can see, nonlinear effects, positive and negative, right? We can talk about that at some point, like what are the positive and negative side effects long term. That's why I feel it's so important for people to not just think in systems, but kind of know that it's like Elon Musk had said, right? Technology doesn't improve by itself. Left to itself, it even becomes worse. Rocketry, right? Human beings don't improve by ourselves. Left of feedback loop, we'll even desocialize. We'll become isolated. We'll become self-centered. It's the feedback loops of socialization that keep us growing. And so if you change that, you make it about me and dopamine hits, it's dangerous for the rest of us.
Right. And I want to tie back uh, this interesting, rabbit hole conversation to why I think the work that you're doing is so remarkable and also serving the long term. Because I think this whole aspect of systems thinking and building or making engineers be multidimensional really pays off.
Mm.
Because ultimately that will create new generation of thinkers
Mm.
that will inspire and build the next generation. So I
Mm.
really see the value of the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And with that, I want to just slowly get us back
Yeah.
to your your life, and if you could share a little bit about what is a day in your life as a person who is running this academy.
It's like being in a call center in Bangalore. I think that's everybody's life these days. You can't tell morning from night,
True.
day from evening. It's my efficiency with meetings has gone up, but if you ask me in COVID times, yeah, it's pretty much like I empathize deeply with the folks who work in the call center now. But on a good day, I would say I'm kind of, I hack my routines all the time. I've been reading about this for years. The last book on this was Make Time by Jake Knapp and Jake Zeratsky, ex-Googler, super book. So the way I think about my work is I leave my conversations for the afternoon. My golden hours are about 8 to 11. So that's when I get the most amount of energy for creative work. And so, that book suggests having one big thing you want to focus on, the highlight of your day. And so I try and keep it for that. This is, by the way, an ideal day. It doesn't work like this all the time, but on an ideal day, I keep time for that. And that's usually some form of writing, some form of synthesis, or some form of outlining some material that I'm hoping to create, anything that forces me to kind of work in a synthetic mode, right? It's not, unless I'm like right in the middle of a program where responsiveness is important, then I'm responding to mails thoughtfully. But otherwise, I'm trying to not do mails and think about, well, how should we teach engineers how do you validate experiments? Let me do an outline for that. Or let me find out if I know how to use Camtasia and just improve the transition a little bit. So either I'm trying to up the level of production on what I'm doing, or I was speaking to a startup and I'm wondering how people go to 0 to 1, and maybe I can write a blog on value parameters, which is what I'm thinking about right now. So I'll use that space for that. And then, like you, I make lunch in the afternoon. It's usually sandwiches, and then I have to walk my dog, so she will come in somewhere in between. And then the second half is meetings and post processing. What I do these days is I use my emails as a way of thinking. It used to be really functional when we were in person, like, just like short messages. But I find that now I use that as a chance to practice writing. Like if there is a quick question, I would, where possible, give a thoughtful response. Sometimes I flag it and saying this is blog length, so please park it away, but I want you to do pre-reading before we meet. So I'm experimenting with those kind of things. But the theme to all of this is I find that writing clarifies my ability to know what I'm thinking about. Sometimes this is today's example that we're thinking about. We have a couple of projects that we're doing for customers. Our engineers are helping them out, and how do we get them to say it worked for us. And in writing the mail, it became clear how it should work for us. And so literally one of my team members wrote it and says, oh, now it's clear to me what I really want, and continue writing the mail. So things like that. That's generally the texture of my days. But my goal always is, so I structure it. End of the day, I would do an inventory. I say, what have I accomplished? What's added to my list? Create the sheet again the next day and put down my might-do list, not my to-do list, and then go down again. At the end of the day, I kind of look it up and think, okay, what did I carry over? So everybody has their workflows. This has been working me for a few years, which is have one highlight and then have a list of might-dos and then do it over the next day. But that's roughly how it's bucketed. My ideal day has got about an hour and a half in the morning just for me, about an hour in the afternoon for learning, catching up on things, and then 2 to 3 hours somewhere for meetings and catching up on mails.
It's actually really interesting. I like talking to people, really getting to know their day. And obviously, most of the people I have spoken to, because I'm living in this bubble of talking to the same set of people who do things similar to what I'm doing right now, are taking a similar approach, especially I think after the initial surprise of this whole pandemic it's kind of settled down and people really got into the groove. Okay, this is going to be for the long term, so we need to really figure out their lives. And I think that's where they became very mindful about how they operate and not get into the zone of like I like the example of using emails not just as functional thing but now a means to think. I think I've seen these practices, so thank you for sharing that. I have a small clarifying question to something that you just said.
Sure.
You talked about do list and not to-do list. Share a little bit about that.
A might-do list, it's a might-do list.
Might-do list, okay.
And and this comes straight from Make Time with Jake Knapp and Jake Zeratsky, I think, or is it John Zeratsky? And so the insight is that there is a difference between determination and concentration. By that I mean, if you put down things on a list and saying it's to do, right? It's a determination that you will do it. You're making a promise to yourself, and if you break it, it feels terrible. Like, oh man, look at that stuff I left undone. Whoa, right? And a concentration is that I have a list of 15 things. I don't think I can do all 15. I'm going to concentrate and see which ones I can, and not have a psychological whiplash at the end of it and start over again. That self-criticism is not useful because that list is never done. And you can look at all the systems of doing to-do lists, from getting things done to what these guys say, right? It really helps to not punish yourself. So the might-do list allows you to put down everything that you think needs to be done without feeling the guilt of completion. Saying, I've got my highlight for the day, and sometimes it's a personal highlight. I've got to get, potassium for my cat who's in early stages of kidney disease, and that's the most important thing for the day. If I get that done, I feel happy. I did something meaningful. And other times it's work. But outside of the highlight, I have a list of might do's, and this is expanding, right? It sometimes fills up the entire right side of my page, but I don't feel bad about it. If I take off anything from that list, I feel good, right? So that framing has been useful for me, saying, I might do this rather than to do.
I like that a lot. I think it's very interesting use of positive psychology to really improve your motivation and also your mental health. You don't have to worry about like going through so many tasks which are undone. So thank
Yeah,
you. I think
yeah.
this book is amazing. I haven't read that. I have heard a lot
Please
about
do.
Jake Knapp's, especially about the design sprints. I think that's
Yeah,
probably the book I read last of him, and I
yeah,
think awesome. Thank you. I know we went through a lot of different topics, but I really want to ask this question, and that's where we go into the last part of our conversation today. And I said today with an underline that I know we need to get back to this conversation because there's so many things that I would love to talk to in detail. So imagine someone who's listening to this podcast and really gets inspired and says, okay, this is what exactly I want to do. And they may be an engineer like you, they may be um, a designer, any particular role that where they feel there's an opportunity to kind of build towards something that you are doing. What would be your advice for them to especially start? What experiences do you think they should have? If you could share a little bit of insight on that, that'll be really interesting for our audience.
yeah. I was only half joking when I said, the mess that is my career. I take the position that nobody can really give anybody advice about career because each one is like a piece of art, right? It was your own map. So the best I can do is share the experiments I've run on mine and hope that some of the experiments make sense to you, but knowing fully well that your map is different from mine and you may have to come up with new experiments, and I hope to learn from that. So, with that in mind, I would say I think this business of passion is a little hokey. You know it looking backward. You can feel pulls. You can feel pulled towards certain things. Like I feel pulled into one material and not the other, and that's true. But is it long term or not? You don't know. So my approach has been to first of all try and do something that feels purposeful to me because I'm going to commit life energy, and I consider life energy sacred and not to be wasted. And I've also tried to always have a side bet. This work comes from Cal Newport's book Deep Work, which is oh no, so it's not Deep Work, it's the one before, which is So Good They Can't Ignore You, which is you will not always be in the job that you like. You might also not know what you want instead. So place a few bets on the side, which are inexpensive, right? Try something, try apprenticing, try moonlighting, whatever it takes to see what it feels like. And if that feels good, give it a little more energy. If it's not, don't give it any more energy. And so along the way, as you do one thing, you might find something that you thought was a small bet blows out into something larger. And that's been the case with me with Startup by Design, my approach to teaching startups, the work I do with them. Everything I've done with them is now fed right back into the academy, and now the engineers are learning it, right? And so it's an alternative approach to the design process. And it's super pragmatic and it's evolved, but it was all started as a side bet. And same thing for personal passions. Maybe you think you like cooking, maybe you don't. Give it a little bit of time. Go for a course, a brief course, learn knife skills, try it out, see if it makes sense. And if you feel there is a pull for you, it'll stick. If not, don't bother. Keep going, right? And so that I feel is a useful way, like, have a hypothesis, but gut check yourself and saying, okay, let me invest a little bit of time. That's mostly what I've done, right? And then I always have a very visceral feeling when I'm not adding value. So I know very clearly that this gig is done. There's nothing more here. But I don't know what else to do. So then I'll start the process again. That's been useful for me. But I pretty much believe that every career you will go through like three, maybe four in a lifetime where you have to, hopefully, it won't be like a shift in your core discipline, right? You will still be an engineer or a designer, but the way you apply it will be dramatically different. You may be expected to apply engineering from a humanities lens rather than a pure engineer's lens, and that will feel like a huge shift to you. And so place a few bets and see if it works, and then share with other people what you did.
I like that a lot. I think placing bets, running experiments, that's probably, I think I can summarize this entire conversation today.
This one's
We
a
are
big bet to make the whole conversation.
we are almost done, and I don't want to close this conversation without asking. I think you shared a lot of books and interesting recommendations, but um, what are the books that really influenced you and you recommend people to read and reflect?
Mm. I won't add any to the list. I mean, there's constantly something or the other. Right now, I'm thinking about lifelong learning and mastery, so that's a whole new thing. But the classics for me was Dennis Sherwood and Seeing the Forest from the Trees. So if you're interested in systems thinking, that's a really good way to jump into it. It's really practical. It's, not abstract at all. I mentioned Make Time, which is really
Hmm.
useful for getting your day sorted. So Good They Can't Ignore You, Cal Newport. If you like Newport's work, Deep Work is the next one.
Yeah, I love Deepak.
Right,
Oh, yeah.
right. So really, really practical stuff. And the last thing I read, which I found interesting, um, let me think about that for a second. A lot of psychological books that I would recommend, but not anytime soon. Mm, but I'm just walking around seeing my stack. No, I would recommend it, but if you should read it and tell me what you think. It's called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's been recommended highly by bunches of people. It tells you why the education system is the way it is by Paulo Freire. But the premise is fascinating, which is education has looked at. He calls it deposit education. I've got to deposit knowledge in your head, and you can only receive as an empty vessel, and that has consequences. So that's on my list, but I'll tell you how it goes once I finish reading it.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, Rana.
yeah,
Um, this has been fun. I mean, this is so interesting. We can continue talking
indeed,
about it in a long
indeed.
format, which I would love to do. And, I will hunt you to get on
Well,
this. And
yeah, if your users don't throw up, then we can talk. But they're like, "What was that,
you know
dude? What are you
what?
guys
Yeah,
talking about?"
I have a high expectations from my readers and from my listeners. I think they
I
demand more.
know that.
So, I really love this conversation. There was
Cool.
so much to talk about, and I really
Right.
like this exchange. And yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we should connect again. I think this is fantastic. This is brilliant. So, thank you so
Yeah.
much for your
You bet.
time.
My
We
pleasure.
went over the time, but I really appreciate,
Yeah.
you being there. And last small bits, like if someone wants to reach you, what is the right medium to get to you?
The easiest would be, and this is not a plug, it's just a way for me to, that's the only site I have. It's called Startup by Design. So Startup by Dr. Design. That's where I do my thinking. So, stop by, leave a note, or there's probably like a form that you can say hi in. So, fair warning, that's where I put my work out for startups. So it may not be me. It's
Hmm.
just how I think about the startup process. But that's probably a good way because I don't have multiple websites. That's a good way for you to reach out to me. I'm not on social media. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. So if you say post something there, you won't hear back from me.
Okay.
Uh,
Startup dot design. Startup by dot design. Is that right?
Dot design. Yeah,
All
exactly.
right. All right. I will leave that on the show notes so
Okay.
people can find you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, it was fun. And
We
we
will
should talk
chat.
soon.
Yeah, you bet.
Absolutely.
All right. Take
Thank you for joining this podcast. I hope this was useful and you learned a lot. For more such great podcasts, please do not forget to subscribe to the podcast channel In Your Shoes on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Music. New podcasts are uploaded every 2 weeks. Goodbye.